Yes, well, you're in a minority suddenly as a winner, because I'd been there the year before as a loser, and it's a much bigger party.
There is a particular kind of sadness that comes with watching someone who has spent a lifetime portraying dignity, grace, and quiet strength face the most undignified moments of real life. Colin Firth has spent more than 4 decades on stage and screen giving audiences characters they could believe in, men of honor, of restraint, of deep and complicated feeling. And yet, behind every standing ovation, behind every award acceptance speech delivered with characteristic humility, there has been a private story unfolding that most people never fully understood. Now, at 65 years old, the full picture of Colin Firth's life reveals something far more complex and far more painful than his polished public image ever suggested. To understand where Colin Firth stands today, it is worth understanding where he began. He was born on the 10th of September, 1960, in the small village of Greyshot in Hampshire, England. His was not a show business family in any conventional sense. His father, David Firth, was a history lecturer who also worked as an education officer for the Nigerian government. His mother, Shirley Jean Rawls, taught comparative religion at what is now the University of Winchester. Faith, scholarship, and service were the pillars of his upbringing. Both sets of his grandparents were involved in Christian ministry, and both his parents were born in India during the era of British colonial presence, giving the family a distinctly international outlook from the very beginning. Colin's childhood was restless and unsettled in ways that left a lasting mark on his personality. Because of his father's work, the family spent years in Nigeria during his early childhood. When he was 11, they relocated to St. Louis, Missouri, where Colin found himself once again the outsider, the boy who did not quite fit. He later described those American years as genuinely difficult. When the family eventually returned to England, he enrolled at a state secondary school in Winchester, where his struggles continued. He was bullied, mocked for seeming different, and responded by adopting the local accent and pretending to share his classmates' indifference to learning. It was a survival strategy, and it worked, but it came at a cost. Beneath the performance of ordinariness, something more sensitive and more searching was quietly developing. What saved him, or at least gave him direction, was drama. He began attending drama workshops at the age of 10, and by 14 he had already decided, with unusual certainty for someone so young, that acting was what he wanted to do with his life. School itself never inspired him, and he later admitted feeling deeply disconnected from formal education. The exception came during his 2 years at Barton Peveril Sixth Form College in Eastleigh, where an English teacher named Penny Edwards unlocked in him a genuine love for literature. Those years, he later said, were among the happiest of his life. From there, he moved to London, joined the National Youth Theatre, worked in the wardrobe department at the National Theatre, and eventually trained formally at the Drama Centre London. He was building something, slowly and deliberately, in the way that people who have never felt entirely at home anywhere tend to build things, with great care, because they cannot afford to lose what they have found. His professional rise was steady rather than explosive. Stage work came first, followed by television and then film. In 1984, he made his screen debut in the film adaptation of Another Country, playing alongside Rupert Everett in a role that hinted at the thoughtful, internally complex performances that would define his career. He appeared opposite the legendary Laurence Olivier in the television adaptation of Lost Empires, and by the late 1980s he had been grouped by the British press with other emerging talents of his generation, including Tim Roth and Kenneth Branagh, as part of what was called the Brit Pack. He took bold and challenging roles, portraying injured Falklands War veteran Robert Lawrence in the BBC drama Tumbledown in 1988, a performance that earned him a Royal Television Society Best Actor Award and a BAFTA nomination. He was building a reputation not as a glamorous leading man, but as a serious actor willing to go to uncomfortable places. Then came 1995, and with it a moment that changed everything. The BBC adaptation of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice cast him as Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy, and almost overnight Colin Firth became one of the most recognized faces in British television. His portrayal of Darcy, proud, repressed, quietly passionate, and ultimately redeemed, connected with audiences in a way that transcended the period setting. Women adored him. Critics praised his restraint. A particular scene involving a lake, not found in Austen's original novel, became one of the most discussed moments in British television history. He had arrived, and he had arrived in a way that could have easily become a trap. The danger of being typecast as the brooding romantic hero was real, and Colin Firth navigated it with more intelligence than most actors in his position might have shown. He played against his own image in Bridget Jones's Diary in 2001, casting an affectionate and self-aware glance back at his Darcy persona while delivering a performance full of warmth and comic timing. He appeared in serious literary adaptations, quirky independent films, and mainstream crowd-pleasers alike. The English Patient, Love Actually, Girl with a Pearl Earring, and eventually Mamma Mia. He moved between registers with remarkable ease, always bringing something honest and grounded to whatever he was given. But it was the period between 2009 and 2011 that truly defined his legacy as an actor. In Tom Ford's quiet, devastating film A Single Man, Firth played George Falconer, a university professor in 1960s Los Angeles who is privately grieving the sudden death of his longtime male partner and contemplating ending his own life. The performance was almost entirely internal, grief controlled by manners, pain disguised by routine, a man disappearing behind the performance of ordinary days. Critics called it the finest work of his career. It earned him an Academy Award nomination, a BAFTA nomination, and the Volpe Cup for Best Actor at the Venice International Film Festival. Then came the King's Speech. In 2010, Firth portrayed Prince Albert, Duke of York, the man who would become King George VI, a royal burdened by a severe stammer who must somehow find his voice to lead a nation into the uncertainty of the Second World War. The film premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival, where it received a standing ovation on what happened to be Firth's 50th birthday. The awards that followed were almost unprecedented in their sweep. The Golden Globe, the Screen Actors Guild Award, his second consecutive BAFTA, and finally, on the 27th of February 2011, the Academy Award for Best Actor. The film earned more than $400 million worldwide. Colin Firth, the quiet outsider from Hampshire who had once pretended not to care about school in order to survive the school day, had reached the very summit of his profession. He continued working with the same seriousness and range that had always characterized his choices: Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, Kingsman, The Secret Service, Supernova, and The Staircase among them. In 2025, he took on a role of Dr. Jim Swire in the 5-part television drama Lockerbie, A Search for Truth, portraying a father who lost his daughter Flora in the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 in 1988 and spent decades questioning whether justice had truly been served. The project was not without controversy. Some families of the victims expressed concern that the drama amplified a version of events they disputed. Firth reportedly took those concerns seriously, meeting with Dr. Swire personally, consulting with members of Megrahi's legal defense team, and engaging with investigative journalists who had scrutinized the original conviction. He wanted to be certain he was participating in something responsible. That caution, that moral seriousness, has always been characteristic of him. He has never treated his platform carelessly. Beyond acting, Colin Firth has consistently used his public position to advocate for causes that many celebrities would consider too difficult or too politically risky. He has been a long-standing supporter of Survival International, the organization that defends the rights of tribal peoples around the world. He spoke out in defense of the indigenous San people of Botswana in 2003, condemning the forced eviction of the Ghana and GWI communities from the Central Kalahari Game Reserve. He supported campaigns to protect the Awagwaja people of Brazil from the destruction of illegal logging. He worked with the Refugee Council in Britain, campaigning against the deportation of Congolese asylum seekers who faced genuine danger if returned to their home country, advocacy that reportedly helped secure reprieves for several individuals. He joined Oxfam's Make Trade Fair campaign, co-founded an eco-friendly shop in West London, and launched a website dedicated to connecting film with political and environmental activism. He even served as guest editor for BBC Radio 4's Today programme in 2010, commissioning academic research into whether structural differences in the human brain might correlate with political orientation, research that was formally published with Firth listed as a co-author alongside University College London researchers. Professor John Jost of New York University described him as a genuine scientific ambassador in the field of political neuroscience. He is, in every meaningful sense, a man who takes the world seriously, which makes the private heartbreak all the more painful. In the mid-2010s, Colin Firth and his wife of more than 2 decades, Italian producer Livia Giugioli, went through a quiet and largely private separation. Few people outside their immediate circle knew it was happening. They had married in 1997 after meeting on a film set in Italy. They had 2 sons together, Luca and Matteo, and had built a life divided between London and a villa in Umbria that Livia had transformed into an eco-conscious retreat. To the outside world, they represented something rare and admirable, a stable, principled, genuinely loving partnership in an industry not known for either stability or principle. When they reconciled after their separation, it seemed as though the difficult chapter had passed. But in 2018, the story that emerged publicly was more complicated and more damaging than any simple narrative of reconciliation could contain. Livia had filed stalking charges against a journalist and family acquaintance named Marco Brancaccia. Colin publicly supported her, issuing a statement describing the situation as deeply distressing. The British press largely accepted the story as presented. Then, in 2019, Livia withdrew the charges and acknowledged that her relationship with Marco during the period of separation had been consensual. What had been described as harassment appeared, in significant part, to have been the painful aftermath of a mutual relationship ending badly. The legal case collapsed. The Italian press was harsh in its response. The British press was quieter. For Colin Firth, the damage was not primarily to his public image, though that too was complicated. The damage was personal and profound. He had defended someone who had not been entirely honest with him. He had placed his name, his reputation, and his trust behind a version of events that turned out to be incomplete. He had been, in a sense, loyal to the point of his own hurt. In December 2019, he and Livia announced their separation publicly. The divorce was finalized in 2020, as the pandemic locked the world indoors and Colin Firth found himself navigating the end of a 22-year marriage in isolation. Friends who spoke anonymously to journalists noted that he had begun therapy, working through not only the betrayal but also deeper questions about his own patterns, whether his steadiness had sometimes been a way of avoiding painful truths, whether his loyalty had occasionally crossed the line into willful blindness. These are not small questions for anyone. For a man who has spent his entire adult life exploring the inner lives of complicated characters, men undone by grief, by duty, by the gap between who they are and who the world requires them to be, they must have felt particularly close to the bone. At 65, Colin Firth remains one of the most respected and genuinely accomplished actors of his generation. His awards, his body of work, his record of thoughtful advocacy, and his decades of quietly serious engagement with the world all speak for themselves. But behind the still waters of his public presence, there has always been more than the surface suggested. A childhood spent learning to perform ordinariness to avoid being hurt. A marriage that looked perfect from the outside and proved more fragile within. A public scandal that forced a private reckoning. A man learning, perhaps later than he might have wished, the difference between loyalty and self-erasure.